resume.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Today we're dealing with effluents from pulp and paper operations and mines, metal mines in the province. We have 4 witnesses here from BC and Canada. Mr. Doug Hill, Mr. Bob Grace, Ms. Janice Boyd, and Mr. Mike Hagan. And perhaps we can start with having these witnesses sworn.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. I do.
I do.
I do.
You state your name, please.
Douglas Hill.
Speak up and into the mic.
Sorry. Douglas Hill.
Thank you.
Robert Grace.
Janice Boyd.
Michael Hagan.
Thank you. Counsel.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to start by marking the policy and practice report that was prepared for this section of the hearings. It includes pulp, paper, mining, and also municipal wastewater, which will be dealt with in the Tuesday and Wednesday. So this report was dated May 24, 2011, and I'd like that marked, please, as the next policy and practice report.
The PPR number 15.
Thank you. I'll start with you, Mr. Hagan. Could you have put Mr. Hagan's CV up, please? It's at tab 1. Thank you. Is that your CV, Mr. Hagan?
That was my CV, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll have that marked, please.
Exhibit number 1021.
Thank you. And I'll just review a couple of points from it. From 1992 to the present, you've been with Environment Canada in the natural resources sector. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And you began working with the pulp and paper mills regulations in 1996 right through to 2002?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And you have then transferred into responsibility for mines in the province in 2002, and have been the regional coordinator for EEM under the mines regulations since then?
Yes, that is correct. I could clarify one point, though. In 1992, the EEM regional coordinator was Alan Coldy, and in about 1996, Al became section head, and at that time, I became the EEM regional coordinator. I was assisting Al prior to that.
Thank you.
Janice also became a coordinator at that time.
Thank you. Move next to Ms. Boyd, and your CV is in tab 34. Is this your CV?
Yes.
I'll have this marked, please.
Exhibit number 1022.
And you have been you've been with the Environment Canada since quite a ways back, but I'll just focus on your time working with the pulp regulations. Since 1996, you've been involved in administering the pulp regulations. Is that right?
That's correct.
And as
sorry, the environmental effects monitoring part of the pulp mill regulations.
thank you. You're the EEM coordinator. You've been an EEM coordinator since what time?
It was about 96, 97. There was a transition.
Okay, and you've been doing it ever since?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And your work is restricted then to pulp and paper, and Mr. Hagan looks after mines. That's the separation?
That's correct.
All right. Thank you. Next move to Mr. Grace, and your CV is at tab 35. Is that right?
Yep, that's my CV.
Thank you. Can I have that mark, please?
Exhibit number 1023.
And you're in the environmental protection of the Ministry of the Environment, unless it's changed in the last couple of weeks.
No, we stayed the same.
Okay, good. And you started your career with the province as a waste management technician for pollution prevention in 1976.
That's correct.
And in 1984, you became an environmental impact assessment biologist for the division in Kamloops.
Yes.
And you've been there since 1984 doing that work.
I did have a few short stints as acting EQ section head.
Okay. And part of your work as an environmental impact assessment biologist is to conduct and supervise water quality and biological and physical monitoring for the division in the Thompson-Nicola area?
That's correct, and also in the Fraser area, basically from Boston Bar not including Boston Bar, up to about Watson Creek.
And in that work, you look at impacts from both pulp and paper mills and mines, is that right?
That's correct, and anything else that we deal with.
Okay, thank you. And then lastly, Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill's CV is at tab 2. Is that your CV?
Yes, it is.
Could I have that marked, please?
Exhibit number 1024.
Thank you. And you have an engineering degree from UBC, Mr. Hill?
Yes.
And you've been the head of the environmental management section at the province in Williams Lake since 2002?
Yes, for the Caribou region.
And prior to that, from 1998 to 2002, you were a senior environmental protection officer in that region?
Yes.
Okay. And you are responsible for provincial environmental management activities in the region in that role, is that right?
Yes, we.
And in your prior work, and perhaps today, you are also involved in negotiating terms and conditions of permits?
Yes.
And that would include, and your work includes both pulp mills and mining activities?
Yes, we deal with 2 pulp mills in Quesnel and 3 operating mines in the region.
Thank you. All right, my questions will start with questions for Environment Canada. In these hearings, we've learned about the Fisheries Act and Section 36 of the Fisheries Act, and I just wanted to identify that there's 2 regulations under Section 36 of the Act which are of interest for today's hearing. The first one is the pulp and paper effluent regulations, and the second is the metal mine effluent regulations. I could direct that to you, Mr. Hagan.
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you. And the pulp and paper effluent regulations came in first, is that right?
The PPER were promulgated in 1992.
Which is prior to the mines regulation.
And the MMER came into effect in 2002.
Okay. Ms. Boyd, I want to talk to you about pulp to start. And I've got a couple of corrections to make in the PPR on this front. So my first question to you is, how many mills are there on the Fraser system?
There are 7 mills.
Okay. And in our PPR, we've got the wrong number in there, so I just want to take you to that. If you can turn to page 67, paragraph 182. Identifies that there's 10
this
pulp.
one. Sorry.
It should be on the screen in front of you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, that's fine. So paragraph 182 identifies 10, so that should be 7?
That should be 7, correct. There's
Okay.
2 in Prince George, 2 in Quesnel. There's 2 near Vancouver in the Lower Mainland instead of 5.
Okay, and the one near Kamloops.
That's correct.
If we go to the footnote for that paragraph, footnote 355, just to confirm, so Northwood Pulp Mill and Prince George Pulp and Paper Mills, Canfor Ltd, those are correct?
That's correct.
And those are the ones near Prince George. And the next 2 that are near Quesnel are Quesnel River Pulp and also Caribou Pulp and Paper Company?
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
That's correct. I guess I was just going to make a comment on the Prince George and Prince George mills are 2 mills side by side and 1 pipe, so we count them as 1.
The Northwood and Prince
No,
George?
the Prince George pulp mills. There's 2, Prince
Oh.
George and Intercon.
I see, so Prince George Pulp and Paper Mills dash Canfor Pulp Limited Partnership, that's 2 mills with 1 effluent discharge?
Yeah, it's, sorry, Canfor, it's Canfor, Prince George, Intercon pulp mills. But they sometimes just collectively call them Prince George mills.
Okay,
Sorry. for
that's
the
fine.
confusion.
We want to be clear, so thank you. Then we just looked at Caribou, so the next one is Cellulose Fibers, Dome Tar, Pulp and Paper. That is the one near Kamloops, that's correct?
That's correct, but the name's actually shorter now, just Domtar Products, Inc. will be sufficient.
Okay,
Then recent name change.
okay. And then we have written down here 5 mills operate near Vancouver. Well, I'll just go through those. You've already said there's 2, so I'll just make that correction. And there's Norampac, Burnaby, Cascades, Canada, that's correct?
That's correct.
And then the next one, Buckeye, Canada, is that wrong?
Buckeye can come out. That's not a pulp mill under the regs.
Okay, and then Kruger Products, we have indicated that, first of all, Kruger is one of the ones near Vancouver.
That's correct.
And we have indicated that it has 3 locations, is that wrong?
It just has 1 pulp mill location.
Okay,
The others might be a furnished source like trees.
Okay, thank you. And then paragraph 183 of the PPR identifies mills on the shores of the Strait of Georgia and other marine areas, and I understand that Gold River is not correct. That should be taken out.
Yes, it was closed by 1998.
Okay. And then also Squamish and Elk Falls closed. I understand Squamish is correct in closing in 2006, but Elk Falls actually closed in February '09. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
But it announced permanent closure in 2010.
Now, the mills that are identified in paragraph 182, as we've corrected it, are those mills all subject to the PPER?
Yes.
And this question could go to either Ms. Boyd or Mr. Hagan. In 1992, when the new regulations came in, this is the PPER that we're talking about, what were the significant changes from the previous regulations or scheme which governed pulp effluent in the province or in the country?
I was just going to take it for the pulp and paper. The significant regulation that before that regulation came in, there was less than 10% of the mills that were covered under the regulation. And so this mill brought in all the mills that discharged to an aquatic receiving environment came under the reg, so essentially all the mills across Canada. It also significantly reduced the effluent loads from that, from the mill effluents in terms of measuring suspended solids and measuring biochemical oxygen demand, which is a relative measure of the oxygen demand that effluent has on the system to break down. It also required what is called a non-acutely lethal effluent. It's a bioassay test, and that meant that in doing rainbow trout fry in 100% effluent, 10 of them are put in a tank, and they have to live for those 4 days. At least 5 of them live. Is what the pass is, but generally all of them live these days after the regulations. Hopefully that was clear.
Were there changes to regulation of dioxins and furans?
There were 2 regulations that came in at the same time that the 1992 pulp and paper effluent regulations came in, and those basically curtailed the release of dioxins and furans into the receiving environment. The other addition I forgot to note for the pulp and paper was the requirement of an environmental effects monitoring program to verify that these load limits were adequate. And it was the first time in a regulation that they had this verification in a national reg.
Okay. And can I summarize the monitoring components of the regulation as including identification of it prescribes the biochemical oxygen demand limits. It prescribes the limits of suspended solids and also addresses acutely lethal effluent. There's that first component, correct?
Correct.
And then the next component is the requirement for environmental effects monitoring, as you've just described, and as we'll get into some detail.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
There are other parameters that are monitored, but those were the core parameters that you noted were what have limits.
Okay. And you are the environmental effects management or monitoring, coordinator. And what is contained in that role? Like, what do you do in that role?
I advise the mills as required so that they can meet the regulations of the environmental effects monitoring program. I review all of their submissions as required under the regulation and make sure that they come in as required and contain what's required. I provide that data to the national office so that they can wrap up the data into a national analysis so that we can work towards it, determining if the regulations are adequate or whether we still see effects in the receiving environment.
Do you ever attend at the mills to review compliance?
Not for Well, yes, the short answer is yes. We do go out in the field to a select number of mills to verify that they are undertaking the program as prescribed in their design. I was also thinking of, I do attend the mills with enforcement who are looking at compliance from the effluent discharge perspective.
Okay.
But they are lead in that.
Tax monitoring role, but are you also involved in assessing applications for effluent discharge authorizations?
I will prepare them, but there is a designated authorization officer who would sign those. But if I would receive the applications and make a recommendation on what to authorize.
And your region is all of BC, is that right?
That's correct. I guess it's BC and Yukon, but we only have mills in BC.
And do you have any staff that assist you in these responsibilities?
No.
All right. Just for reference, not to make corrections this time, but for reference, if we can turn to page 1, paragraph 167 of the PPR, which is on page 61. We've summarized here the basic parts of the regulation as I just identified with you orally. And I just wanted to note that the regulation prescribes certain deleterious substances in pulp and paper mill effluent, and that's under section 3 of the regulation, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And it includes
yes.
acutely lethal effluent, so that's considered a deleterious substance?
That's correct. So failing a 96-hour LC50 test with rainbow trout.
Okay. And then BOD matter, and that's the biochemical oxygen demand. Can you explain what that is and how is that a deleterious substance?
What it defines in the regulations is a limit at which they impose on mills. So below that, they don't consider that a deleterious substance. Above that is. But it's essentially the organic matter that is, it's a measure of the demand of oxygen in the receiver for that, to break that down. So the higher that is, the more that you're taking from the oxygen in the system itself. Okay.
And then the last thing that's just prescribed as a deleterious substance are suspended solids.
Yeah, that's, it's again, well, solid and or organic matter that, again, will have, there's, in some cases, it can cause a smothering, and in some cases, it has chemicals that are attached to it that also bring contaminants into the receiving environment.
Okay. And then paragraph 168 on the next page of the PPR, just as a summary of the regulation, it describes the deleterious substances that I've just reviewed with you. It prohibits the discharge of acutely lethal effluent and sets out limits for BOD and TSS, which is total suspended solids. Is that right?
That's correct.
And these quantities are determined by a formula that's set out in the regulation, as well as some other conditions. So it's not simply this amount per milliliter. It's a formula that's created.
It's a formula, so it's almost like a per ton of product. So there's a formula that's defined in the regulation. Each year, the load limits are set based on what's called their reference production rate. And the reference production rate is the highest 90th percentile in the last 3 years.
Okay. That regime sets out the authorized discharges under the regulation, and anything other than outside of those authorized limits is considered, or could be considered, an offense.
Yes.
Okay.
Unless they have an authorization that there's ability to also have an authorization that may be different from Section 14, which is the standard that most mills use.
All right. Can a more stringent monitoring of these deleterious substances be required of a mill?
Yes, there is capacity within the pulp and paper effluent regulations to have special, I don't know if it's still called special regulation, but within that, like for example, in the pulp and paper regs right now, we have Part 2, which applies to one mill. So there's special limits for that particular mill.
Okay. Is that the only mill where there's been a special number set?
Yes.
Is that the Port Alberni mill?
That's correct.
Okay. And how often are I take it, sorry, that each mill needs to monitor in accordance with the regulation, these discharges, and I'm not even sure how to describe them, but these parameters?
That's correct. It's defined in Schedule 2 of the reg when.
And how often are the results of that monitoring reported to Environment Canada?
They're reported monthly, and they're required to be reported within 30 days of the end of a given month.
Okay. And how often do they actually have to do the monitoring?
It depends on the parameter. Suspended solids is daily, flow is daily. Biochemical oxygen demand is 3 times per week. The acutely lethal effluent is tested once per month, and the Daphnia magna toxicity test is once per week. And then there's pH and conductivity, which are also measured daily, and flow, if I didn't say that one already.
Yeah, you did. Thanks.
And production, sorry. Sorry.
In tab 4 of the Commission's documents is a summary which outlines a system for reporting, which is called the Regulatory Information Submission System. It should be at tab 4 of the Commission documents. All right, and can you explain what this system is, just in a general overview sense?
It's an electronic database that mills can enter their pulp paper effluent regulation data into. This, for pulp and paper, it doesn't include the environmental effects monitoring data, only the effluent data.
So that the information that we have just been describing is entered into this electronic system?
That's correct.
Could I have this, Mark, please, as the next exhibit?
Exhibit number 1025.
And this RISS system is also used under the mining regulation, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And does this system, is it used to assess compliance with the deposit limits under the different regulations?
Primarily, the inspectors and enforcement will be using it they will monitor the compliance in there. I may look at the data sometimes if I see something, because if I'm using the data, so I have access to it as well. But they're the primary users to monitor compliance for their mills.
Okay, so this is the tool that's used to enforce compliance, essentially, or the initial stage of enforcing.
I was going to say, the inspectors going on site helps enforce compliance, but definitely it's a tool that helps them.
Okay. And has that electronic system improved compliance? Do you know?
That would be an enforcement question but to qualify it would, it puts information at their fingertips better, because it will come in, and then once it's into the system, then the inspectors can look at it right away, and there are queries that allow them to pull up specific violations. They'll say, you can ask if a given mill has exceeded limits. So it will pull up that information. It's designed so that it makes it easier for the inspector to see if a violation occurs.
And are the results of that system, or is the system itself provided to the province to assist it in doing its work?
The short answer is the province would get the same data, and actually more, because usually there are more in the permits. But I don't believe they have access per se.
So the province gets the raw data, but they don't get access to the electronic system that the data is stored in. Is that
Theirs
correct?
would be an electronic system also, the
Of their own.
provinces. Yeah.
But there's not a sharing of this kind of monitoring data. It's not a shared database between province and Canada.
I don't believe it is right now, but there is, I think that they're looking into options for that, particularly as we extend the risk system. Like, it started in Ontario, and then it came to BC and the Atlantic provinces. Quebec has a different but similar system because there's a provincial agreement, and there are a couple of provincial agreements for Alberta and Saskatchewan. So there may be looking into an option that could allow that sharing. But we do get the same data already in both electronically.
Do you get the data that's collected with reference to the provincial limits, which may be different from the Canadian limits? Does all that information come to you as well?
We have copies of all the permits, so we know what the limits are.
And does the monitoring data that's done in relation to the provincial permits get forwarded to Environment Canada, or do you just receive the results that are required under the pulp regulation?
That would be an enforcement question, but I know that they do receive, they have received monitoring data in the past. I'm just not sure in what form it comes to them anymore. It used to come in hard copy.
To environmental effects monitoring now. You touched a little bit on this in your introductory answers, but can you just explain what the purpose of EEM is?
The fundamental is to use science and verify in the receiving environment that the load limits that we put on the 1992 regulations were adequate to protect all receiving environments for fish habitat, and the use of fish resources. It was like before we focused on end-of-pipe measures to just measure when loadings drop, but this was an actual verification in the receiver that those limits worked. So we're now working through the process of evaluating the data that we've collected for pulp and paper, and we're further along in pulp and paper than we are for metal mining, so we're coming up with our 6th cycle of data. So we're about at the stage where we can make that determination. But the fundamental is then you can judge whether there needs to be regulatory changes, although we have actually evolved the program so that we get more information and working towards fixing effects that have been observed already.
Okay. And who does the monitoring?
The mills, or the facilities for the mines and the mills, do the monitoring.
You had said earlier that at times your office or you will go out to check that it's being done correctly. Is that the EEM monitoring that you will verify?
That's correct, yeah.
And I understand that the components of EEM are biological monitoring studies, which include a fish survey and also a benthic and vertebrate communities study. So those two components, is that right?
Yes, and also fish survey. And it's prescribed in the regulation which they need to do. Like, they may not need to do a fish survey, for example, if they're not a chlorinated bleaching mill and they don't meet the trigger conditions. They don't require it. Similarly, for fish and benthic invertebrates, for pulp and paper, there are measurements. If your 1% effluent, for example, is less than 250 meters from the outfall, you don't require a fish survey. If it's less than 100 meters from the outfall, you don't require a benthic survey. These didn't come in from the start. They evolved in the program. So after cycle 1, we introduced the fish survey exemption. For one reason, it wasn't practical to measure fish in that short distance because they're moving around, and two, it seemed unlikely that there would be effects in that short distance. And there were also some safety concerns with just trying to measure the fish in that small area.
Okay, but from a conceptual point, there's a fish survey,
Yes.
and there's a benthic survey. Those are both biological studies that are done as part of EEM with
That's
adjustments made, as
That's
you
right,
described.
and a fish tissue survey if it's triggered.
And then also there's sublethal toxicity tests as well?
That's correct.
Okay.
I mean, I guess I would just add that there are, once you look at that data, that may take you, if you see effects, to other phases in the biological monitoring, where you find effects and you go into the phase of investigating those effects and investigating solutions.
Sure. Well, let me take you through it kind of piece by piece, and then maybe we can go through that in some detail. So the first, looking at the fish survey, that's, first of all, as you described, that's intended to assess effects on fish themselves, right?
Yes.
And how is that assessment done? How is the assessment of effects done?
The Mills consultant, they look at common resident species, the ones that would be exposed to effluent, and they target they target two, and sometimes two species, abundant species aren't possible, so there may only be one. But they find a fish species that's basically living in the receiving environment in the exposure area, and they measure core parameters in the fish in exposure and reference area and compare if there's a statistical difference between the two.
Okay, and a reference area being an area that doesn't have a pulp mill associated with it but has the same fish.
Yeah, hopefully it's like upstream, you try and do an upstream, downstream, or there may be conditions if, like for example, an invertebrate species is used for a fish, as defined under the Fisheries Act, it may be a gradient design, so you're at the furthest. You go from a higher exposure area to low or no exposure.
Okay, and then the benthic survey, how is that? That's done to assess effects on fish habitat as opposed to fish?
Yes, it's benthic invertebrates are what the fish may feed on. So
Okay.
the same idea of comparing and of reference and exposure area, and there's core parameters that are measured and compared to determine if there's a statistical difference.
And are the fish and benthic survey data submitted to Environment Canada?
It's either every 3 years or every 6 years, but initially they're on a 3-year cycle, and they do the comparisons and evaluate the effects parameters. If there's no effects in 2 consecutive cycles, then they reduce their monitoring to every 6 years.
Okay.
But if there have effects, then they maintain that 3 years to move forward into investigation of cause.
Okay. What about sublethal toxicity tests? What is that?
The sublethal toxicity tests include invertebrate and plant species now. They originally included fish, but what we found over 4 cycles of data, that from the improvements that the mills made in their effluents, we weren't getting a response out of the fish anymore, so it wasn't a valuable parameter to use any longer, so that was dropped. It was a recommendation that was put forward in the Smart Regulations report, which was looking at the effectiveness of the program in 2005.
And how often are the sublethal toxicity tests conducted, or how often are they conducted, and how often are the results communicated to Environment Canada?
They're conducted twice a year, and they're reported within 3 months of completing the test. Although there is a condition for once per year if they're not depositing effluent less than 120 days of the year.
Now, there's a study design, is that right, that's prepared for each mill to set up the study for EEM, or environmental effects monitoring?
Not necessarily, well, each mill is required to prepare one, but they may do it jointly, such as in the Upper Fraser mills, the Prince George and Quesnel mills do a joint study. So they prepare their document together, but it's all in one, but they meet the requirements for individual mills.
And who designs the study? Is Environment Canada involved in designing the study?
Well, the regulations lay out the requirements, and we also have technical guidance, but the mill and the mill's consultants prepare the document.
Do you review it?
Yes, we review it, and we're often involved in an earlier stage, just in consultation, or we have what's called a local monitoring committee. So we usually meet to discuss the previous results, to discuss the proposed design before they submit a final design, just to make sure that they meet the requirements and that they're on the right track.
And who participates in the local monitoring committee?
It depends on a particular mill and where the interest is, but fundamentally it includes Environment Canada, and it used to include Fisheries and Oceans, but the core governments, Environment Canada and BC Ministry of Environment. For example, I'm on a local monitoring committee with Bob for the Kamloops mill. And then it can also include NGOs, environmental groups, or First Nations, depending on the interest at a given mill.
The RISS system that we looked at earlier, the electronic database, does that database reflect the EEM data coming from the mills?
It's not for, RIS doesn't include EEM data for pulp mills, but it does include some EEM data for metal mines,
Okay.
which Mike can clarify.
Yep. We'll talk about mining, I think, once we get
Yep.
through pulp.
Yep. Yeah.
There's a lot of things to keep our
Yeah,
heads
yeah,
straight here.
yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Is there a compliance element to the EEM monitoring? For example, would enforcement ever be involved in the EEM monitoring program?
Well, they could be. We would refer any problems to them, but we haven't had problems to refer to them at this stage.
And what kind, would they be problems with exceeding limits, or would they be problems with failing to report data or failing to use appropriate methods, or what?
It would be either failing to report the data or using appropriate methods, because the limits are within the non-EEM part of the regulation.
Now, as you said, this regulation has been in longer than mining, and there's been some national assessments of the data, which I want to review with you. After the first 3 cycles, there was a national assessment done, and that is in tab 15. Do you have that on the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't have it on the screen, but I have it in front of me.
Okay. tab
Okay, I have it on the
15.
screen.
All
Sorry.
right. Great. Okay, so what were the first 3 cycles? This was looking at the 3 cycles all across the country, so if I understand it correctly.
That's correct.
And what was being looked at in those first 3 cycles? What was the expectation?
I guess I should clarify, this wraps 3 cycles together, but we actually do a review after every cycle, both of the data and how the program was working, so that we could, like for example, after cycle 1, which is the first time this had been done in a national reg, so there were a lot of problems and kinks to work out. So we actually made the 3-year cycle a 4-year cycle by changing it by 1 year, just so that we could take that time to do it, but we ultimately changed it back to 3. So after cycle 1, in doing this extensive review, we amended the requirements and how the study design works, so we could get good data in 2 and 3. So that actually, so cycle 1 was more about getting the program working, the design working properly, and then I think they used what data they could from cycle 1, but it was more like preliminary sampling, and then cycles 2 and 3 had good sets of data that we could see trends in on the core effects that we're seeing out of the present mill pulp paper effluent.
Okay. If I can ask you to look at the abstract, these are just a couple of high-level kind of questions I want to review with you. I don't want to go into the report in a lot of detail, but if you can turn to the abstract, which is on Roman numeral 3, can 5.
Okay.
And about 7 lines down, there's a sentence that begins the national average response. It begins sort of on the right-hand side of the paragraph.
Oh, right.
Okay, the national average response pattern measured for fish in both cycles 2 and 3 was one typically associated with nutrient enrichment overlaid by metabolic disruption. That is, exposed fish have consistently shown evidence of increased food availability or increased food absorption, fatter, faster growing with larger livers, together with disruption of allocation of resources to reproduction, smaller gonads. So, first of all, is that an observation that is relevant to the mills in BC?
What we do is we look at them on an individual basis. So there are definitely some mills that show enrichment, less so that show what's called metabolic disruption. And all that is just changing where they're putting their energy. So they're putting less energy into reproduction is essentially what the concern is. And then there are mills that show no effects, and some mills that don't require EM anymore because they come within the exemption. So we have a mixed results in BC, but we're basically, the intent is to take the data the national data, so you get enough data to really look at what the pulp mill effects are. Probably it's harder to look on a region by region basis, so we just look at what our individual mills say versus the national results.
All right, so there were mills in BC that showed the responses that are identified in the passage I just read.
Yes, but more enrichment than
Okay.
the smaller gonads.
And then the next line reads, the national average response for benthic invertebrate communities in both cycles 2 and 3 was indicative of eutrophication ranging from mild to more pronounced, partly depending on habitat type. More specifically, benthic invertebrate communities exposed to pulp mill effluent have commonly exhibited increases in abundance, together with some combination of increases, decreases, or no change in taxon richness, depending on the degree of eutrophication. Is that also indicative of the BC mills?
In some cases, but what we see here in BC mills also is there was historical impacts, like particularly on coastal mills, where you may have had more smothering from fiber mats, and but teasing that apart, you're starting to see recovery because of the fundamental changes in the mill process or treatment. So we do see some enrichment, but where it may have been more severe was more historical, and then we tend to see recovery. But there are some present-day enrichment, mills causing enrichment also.
Okay, so those two observations, the enrichment that you see with the fish and also with the benthic community, are those of concern to Environment Canada in BC?
I guess the short answer is we're not concerned just because the way the process is working. We're working towards solutions. Where we started with the pulp mill regulations and the EEM program, and hopefully it's okay to use EEM just because it's ingrained in my brain for 15 years now, but I'll try to be careful with my acronyms. But we've worked through the process of trying to get good data so that we could determine if we have adequate regulations, and then in the 2004 amendments to the regulation, we added a component of investigating cause. So if we saw effects in the mills, then there's a requirement now to investigate that cause. And then in the most recent, well, at least the 2008 amendments, yes, in the most recent cycle, we introduced an investigation of solutions. So we're moving to the past. We are seeing some effects still in the receiving environment from current pulp mill effluents, but we have ways of working towards solutions to that. And I don't know if you want me to add to the investigation of solution part.
No, I'm going to get to that
okay,
as we
sure.
move through the
Yep,
review.
sorry.
So, were any steps taken then with respect to the regulation following this national review of cycles 1 through 3?
Yes, like that. The step was we had what was called the Smart Regulation Initiative, which allowed some policy senior management people in federal government and industry, and there were NGOs and First Nation participants to look at the program and see what further needed to be improved. And so they came up with recommendations focusing on these two core national results that were coming up, how we could move towards focusing better on those, on fixing those effects that we're still seeing in pulp mill effluent.
Okay. Let me, before we move to that, let me mark this national review that we've been looking at as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 1026.
Okay. I'm going to come to that smart regulation
Okay.
document right now, but just one last question before we leave this. On turning to CAN number 7, page number 7, so it's Roman numeral 5 in the abstract. It's an executive summary. It reviews some of the observations that we just talked about. And it does say in the center of this paragraph that this metabolic disruption, which you said hasn't been showing up in BC very much, may include some aspect of endocrine disruption associated with problems in producing sufficient sex steroid hormones. Do you see that line?
Yes.
Is that something that has been observed in BC? Particularly on the Fraser system.
We have, I guess where it, The short answer is we're not seeing that we're not seeing that trend very well. But I guess I should also qualify on the marine side, we've had difficulty in evaluating fish species effectively because the marine is just, it's open, it's an open ocean, and so it's hard to tell, it's hard to do effective fish surveys because they were more designed for fresh water, and we also have deep diffusers. But there is current study that is going on right now to look at, to focus on that particular effect and how we can come up with a better tool to evaluate it in the mills. And that's a large joint study that involves FP Innovations, Paprcan, which is the industry research arm, and some of our Environment Canada Sciences and some of academia and then mills are able to use this project to meet some of their investigation of cause requirements under the regulation. And it allows, I guess, a larger funding pool to better evaluate where there may be endocrine disrupting effects.
Okay. And when is that project expected to be completed?
I think, well, they started in cycle 4. I'm not sure of the exact target date, but they've, I could say, I mean, they're kind of doing it in phases and coming up with tools and trying to find causes. So there's different components to the study. But offhand, I'm not sure where their target date is right now. But within cycle 6, the cycle 6 is, it could be a 3 or 6 year cycle for a given mill, that's what I mean.
When we talk about the different cycles in these national reviews, is it the assumption that they're always a 3-year cycle? Is that how they're being measured? So it would be 9 years or 10 years since the regulation came into effect is when you did that national survey?
Yeah, cycle 4 would have been 2003 to 2004, and then cycle 5 was 2000. Oh, wait a second. I'm starting to lose track. We started cycle 6 on April 1st, 2010. So cycle 5 was 2007 to 2010, and cycle 4 was 2004 to 2007.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Ms. Baker, could I just ask you, for the purposes of the record, the witness is saying things like, we did something, or they are doing something. I don't know who we is, and I don't know who they are.
If I say we, and I'll try and catch myself, I generally mean Environment Canada. I have to try and make sure, though, the distinction in conducting the environmental effects monitoring program, the mills are responsible for conducting it. We evaluate the information. But there's also, I guess, a we part in terms of evaluating the information that we as Environment Canada, as the regulator, and we in terms of trying to improve the tools. The study that I was just talking about for the investigation of cause small gonad study is probably more of a they, in that it's some of our Environment Canada research scientists, but it's also the research arm of the mill, and it's helping, it's a tool for the mills to meet part of their requirement under the regulation.
Hopefully that explains it, and I'll try and listen for those as we go through.
And I'll try and be better.
Tab 27 of the Commission documents is a report of the SMART regulation review, or however you want to describe it. This is what you were talking about when you were talking about the SMART regulation.
That's correct.
Review. Okay, and this was, as it clearly sets out in its title, done to improve and improve the effectiveness and efficiency of pulp and paper environmental effects monitoring. And you indicated that this came as a result of different stakeholders wanting to understand and assess the operation of the regulations.
Yes, I mean, as we went along, Environment Canada would improve how the program was working. But this provided the most recent, I guess, opportunity, and it involved multiple stakeholders who were interested in the environmental effects from pulp mills. And so it was the next opportunity to try and improve how the program worked and to get and make sure we were getting the right results.
And were changes made to the regulation following that review?
Yes, there was recommendations made in here. There were changes made to the regulations. There were upgrades or improvements made to the technical guidance. And there's still some ongoing or in progress, I guess I should say.
In Canada's list of documents, Mr. Dunn, Canada's list of documents, tab number 1. Just have that handy. If we can first mark this review document that we've just got on the screen before you take it off. And then tab 1 of Canada's documents sets out a printout from the website which shows the response to the Smart Regulation Initiative. Is that right?
That's correct.
We'll have that marked, please.
1028.
Thank you. You've talked Canada number 1. You have talked about investigation for cause. Did that happen after cycle 3? And did it relate to this Smart Regulation review?
It was put into the regulation in 2004, which occurred prior to the Smart Regulation Initiative, which was in 2005. But what it did, one of the recommendations regarded having this larger joint study so that industry and the research side to try and work out one of the core effects that was being observed, and that was the smaller fish gonads or reduced reproduction.
Okay. So in 2004, a specific approach was added to the regulation which required people to investigate cause. So where you would see an effect which showed up under cycles 1 through 3, then there would be an opportunity for that proponent or mill owner to investigate the cause of that effect. Is that right?
That's correct. It's a requirement. So if they see they confirm an effect in 2 consecutive cycles, then there's a requirement in the reg to investigate that effect.
Okay. And have any studies been completed yet?
Yes. There were studies completed in cycle 4, starting in cycle 4.
Okay. Did any BC mills have to conduct investigative cause investigations?
They did, but what we discovered in some of them that it related to an historical effect. That's not the case in all, because some are moving into investigation of solutions. For example, some mills with enrichment, but more on the coastal mills tend to have there had been historical effects because there was because of the treatment or lack of treatment in place at the time.
So if you can turn to tab 16 of the Commission's list of documents. And this document is the same kind of assessment that we saw earlier. This deals with assessment of cycle 4 data. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right, I'll have this marked, please.
So 1029.
Thank you. And in this study were the same conclusions that were observed with respect to cycles 1 through 3 seen, that you still had increased growth rate and relative liver size and decreased gonad size?
Generally speaking, it was the same trend, but an interesting shift was that there was a shift in the small gonads, and part of that was determined or likely to be because a component of the mills were now in this joint study, so their they weren't out in the field measuring. They were part of this joint study to evaluate the cause of the effects. So it seemed to suggest that we were on the right track in moving forward at that, to focus on the reduced reproduction.
So the mills that had the most serious effects in cycles 1 through 3 weren't actually assessed in this phase 4 document?
Yes, that's
because
correct.
they'd moved off to another study.
That's correct.
Okay. And was there anything of particular significance to the BC mills, the Fraser River mills, in the cycle 4 assessment?
I guess the short answer is some might not have required EM if they had 2 consecutive cycles of no effects. There were some mills that actually did not require the EM in cycle 4. Otherwise, there were a lot of our investigation of causes in cycle 4, as I was saying, tended to be trying to tease out what were historical effects from present effects. And so they weren't part of that joint study because they didn't actually fit the criteria that were set to be part of it.
Of the 7 mills that are on the Fraser system, can you tell us which of them were going into an investigative cause process and which stayed on the regular cycles?
The Weyerhaeuser mill, sorry, old name, Domtar mill, was on the track of investigating cause and investigating solutions on a nutrient scale, like the nutrient enrichment. But the Upper Fraser mills were having difficulty. The mills were having difficulty determining, getting an adequate measure of the reproductive parameter for the fish because the species that was selected, which was a good sentinel, which is large-scale sucker, seemed to, but they only spawned every other year. So the fish looked like it was big enough, but it wasn't going to spawn that year, and you're trying to sample your parameters on these fish just before they're spawning. So we haven't got to the investigation of cause phase there because we were still working on getting the adequate data for evaluating effects on fish.
And would the Upper Fraser mills include the Prince George mills?
That's correct.
And would it also include the Quesnel mills?
That's correct. Those are the Upper Fraser mills.
Right. And then in cycle 5, there was this introduction of a new concept, which is the introduction of the solutions, investigation of solutions component. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what's the purpose of that?
Part of it was to address concerns from in our consultation process on the regs that environmental groups and First Nations were expressing that we weren't addressing effects. We were investigating the cause, but we weren't addressing the solution. So this was introduced in the regulation so that the next phase after determining the cause, the mill would investigate a way to fix or to eliminate that effect.
And are any of the BC mills at that stage, it sounds like?
Yes, we have 2 that are doing that, that are, one's on the Fraser system, one isn't, but 2, it's for nutrient enrichment.
This is the Domtar?
Yeah, Domtar.
Now, we do have the interpretive report for environmental effects monitoring for the 4 mills in the Upper Fraser, and that was released in March 2010. It's at tab 13 of the Commission's documents. So this shows us being done for the CAN4 Limited Partnership, Quesnel River Pulp, Caribou Pulp and Paper, but that's actually 4 mills, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. I'll have this marked, please.
Exhibit 1030.
It speaks for itself, and I'm not going to, given our short time, I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but I want to understand a few things. Like if you turn to page 5-1, and I don't know what the PDF number for that is, I'm sorry.
That's
About
Yep.
just wait till he gets it up on the screen here. So fish tissue analysis, whoops, there we go. Fish tissue analysis is on page 5-1, and it indicates here that there was no fish tissue analysis required. How was that decision made?
It's based on the requirements in the regulation. It stipulates that if dioxins and furans in fish tissue exceed 15 picograms per gram in the muscle tissue, or 30 picograms per gram in the liver, then the mill is required to conduct a fish tissue survey. Or if their effluent exceeds, if their effluent toxins and furans are measurable, then they're required to do so. But generally, the dioxins and furans regs have eliminated the dioxins and furans, and so we generally see no measurable dioxins and furans.
And when was the assessment done of fish tissue to rule out that as a component, a regulatory component for these mills? Would that have been done on the first cycle or the second cycle?
I'm trying to remember. Sorry. Can I ask Mike?
Yeah,
Just because it was his mill at the time, but I'm just thinking that they weren't triggered in ever.
Yeah, certainly Mr. Hagan can answer this if he's got the information, absolutely.
Yes, I can answer that. I'm just waiting for the text to catch up a bit here so I can see what the question was. Okay, I guess the question with response to dioxin and furan monitoring is we had a trend monitoring program conducted all through the 1990s, which was about the time that cycles 1 and 2 were being conducted. And there were no, I don't believe there were health advisory in the upper basin of the Fraser River. There were studies conducted. There were health advisories issued in the Strait of Georgia for bottom fish and for crab. Some of those are still in place. I'm just checking to see if I've got the question correct here. Perhaps you could rephrase the question so I can be clear on that.
Sure, Ms. Boyd had explained that they weren't showing any fish tissue contaminant, and I asked, when was that assessment done? Because it sounds like that is no longer being done, that there's no longer an analysis of fish tissues to see if those contaminants are present. So when was the last sampling done, and why? How can you rule that out for the present?
Okay, there's still sampling being conducted in the Strait of Georgia for those mills in the marine environment for Crofton, Harmac, and Port Mellon. Those are being conducted every 3 years yet.
This is for the Quesnel and the Prince George mills that I'm asking about.
I don't believe there's fish tissue analysis going on in the Fraser Basin itself in the freshwater environment, no.
But ever, I don't think that ever was triggered. That's
no, it never triggered. No, the monitoring was done under the National Dioxin Monitoring Program initially, but to the best of my knowledge, it was never triggered under the EEM provisions in the PPER.
because it would have been below the limits.
Okay, it was below the limits, always. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, yeah, like once the regulations came in and they were under the regulations, I don't believe they were ever triggered into having to do that, the dioxins furan monitoring.
All right. And then similarly on the following page, which is 6-1, this is the benthic invertebrate survey. It says that that is also not being required for these mills, and how is that assessment done?
That was done in the cycles before, so in cycles 2, 3, and 4, they would have looked at the exposure and reference area, and they would have concluded that there were no effects in the core benthic vertebrate parameters. So then in response to what the regulations allowed, they're able to not require another survey for 6 years.
Okay. So they're now on a 6-year cycle for that
For that
particular-
component.
Okay. So the only sampling that's being done right now is the fish survey sampling, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
And there's some lethal toxicity testing.
So was enrichment found in these mills?
Yes, that was the general. It was either enrichment or there was no significant difference in the core parameters, but it was more of an enrichment, notwithstanding the issues that we're still trying to evaluate with the fish reproduction.
All right, and is that why the mills are undergoing the investigation of cause phase, or are they in that?
These ones are still looking at the fish. They were trying to evaluate the fish. They've evaluated the other parameters for fish, but they were having difficulty with the reproduction. So that's where this study was now focused.
Okay. Since the regulations were brought in, has there been an assessment by Environment Canada generally about, in particular, looking at the dioxin issue? Has the control of dioxins been effective since the regulations were brought in 1992?
Yes, and I don't know if this might be a better area for Mike, but the short is that it was a significant drop in the dioxins and furans, essentially 99% elimination from basically the two dioxins and furans regulations under CEPA, but also the improvements that the mills made under the pulp and paper effluent regulations also contributed to those reductions with better treatment.
Right. And Mr. Hagan, you did a study as well, did you not, with respect
Yes.
to dioxins and furans?
Ms. Baker, would this be a good place for the break?
I wonder if I've got like 1 or 2 questions and then I can finish pulp completely and come back with mining. Would that be possible? Okay. So that study, sorry. Do you have the tab reference? Tab 12 in the Commission's documents. All right, you're the author of the study that assessed the effects of.
Yes, the lead author, yes.
Okay, and what was the general conclusion of that study?
The general conclusion is essentially that the measures brought in by the mills in response to the regulatory package and the work they did prior to that resulted in a 97% drop in dioxin furans or greater in effluent, and also we measured a drop of 85% in crab or greater in other species of fish in the marine environment. I'm talking about the marine environment here. So all those changes that the mills made in their process resulted in significantly lower levels in the environment that we measured.
I'll have that mark, please.
Exhibit 1031.
And I just want to finish up by asking about concerns of significance currently in pulp mill effluent and Fraser River sockeye, and I'll ask you that, Ms. Boyd. What concern, or has Environment Canada identified any concerns of significance? We've talked about the enrichment issue. Are there any other concerns of significance with pulp mill effluent and Fraser River sockeye?
Okay, I'm just waiting for the captions to catch up a bit.
Oh, was that to Mike? Sorry.
I
No,
don't
it was
know
to-
well
it
if
was
it
to you.
is. It's real-time
to me.
captioning, I'm relying on this, but it takes a few seconds.
The short is that EEM per se doesn't evaluate the sockeye. It's designed to look at a resident fish species, but I guess the potential comparison is that the sockeye would only be in the river for shorter periods of time, going up through, like past the mills when they're going up to spawn, or coming down as smolt. So we target the resident species because if we got no effects by comparing an exposure and reference area, we couldn't conclude that there were no effects because they have less, they're less exposed.
Okay. Are there any pulp mills discharging into rearing lakes for rearing lakes for Fraser River sockeye?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And then on the PPR paragraph 195, there's a correction, I think, to be made, page 71.
Could I just add on
Yep.
that comment, just in, Bob just suggested, like in Kamloops Lake, that would be one potential. I didn't think they reared in there, but then that would be a DFO question.
Do you want me to elaborate?
Why don't I want to get through this last question with Ms. Boyd, and I'll come back. I'll just make a note to ask you that when I get to those questions with you. So paragraph 195, the last sentence of this paragraph says the response of PBDEs to improvements in pulp mill processes is not yet well understood. Does Environment Canada understand that there are PBDEs in pulp mill effluent?
The short answer is I recall seeing something from our Environment Canada scientists that suggested they didn't believe they were in the pulp mill effluent, but I don't know what that source is. The short of it is they may be, but it's not an area that I know specifically.
Mr. Hagan, do you have any other information to assist there?
No, that's not my area either, so I can't really comment on that.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.
Sorry.